Hey y'all. Sometimes our wildlife here in Appalachia is not what it seems. Sometimes something sinister masquerades as something innocent, the predator posing as prey. The Appalachian not deer is an encounter with a supposed deer that leaves one questioning if that animal was in fact a deer or something more ominous. I have a collection of stories for you today from people who have experienced a not deer themselves. I'm Candace, and I'll be your guide. There are a lot of deer in my area, and I just got back from a walk on a trail that I frequent. I was about a half mile into the walk when I came across a deer in the middle of the trail. Immediately, I noticed that it had backwards back legs, and its eyes looked exactly like a person's. I know what a deer's eyes look like, and I know what a person's eyes look like. This thing had human eyes. I was frozen in my tracks, and the deer turned to look at me with this kind of hateful, evil expression I can't describe, before standing up on its back legs and walking into the forest like a person. I ran for it and ran the whole way back to my car, and I'm shaking right now telling you this. What was that? Really not sure what I saw a few years ago, so I'll try to keep it short. Around 4 or 5 years ago, my husband and I were on our way to work about 6 in the morning. He was driving and I was looking out the passenger window into the cornfield. I caught sight of a deer, but something felt off. It really felt like time slowed down as I watched the deer rise up on its hind legs. This intense feeling of dread made my stomach turn, and for a second, it almost felt like I was going to vomit. For height reference, the corn had only grown about 5 feet or so, but this deer was at least 6 feet or more. I noticed its eyes were solid white. Its head was straight up, and its front legs just dangled there. The best way to describe what I saw was if you hollowed out a deer and climbed into it. The creepiest thing about it was it looked like it had a seam from under its chin down to its chest, and what looked like a human eye peeking out of the slit. All I could think was, don't make eye contact. I looked away really quickly. This all happened in a matter of seconds, but it felt like minutes. I was driving home alone at 1 a.m. in June 2012. This was near Regalsville, Pennsylvania, in Bucks County. As I was coming up to a curve, I noticed what I thought to be a deer moving through the brush to my right. It was about to cross the road in front of the car, so I braked hard to avoid a collision. As the deer crossed the road in front of the car, I was just clearing the bend and could see the road ahead. I immediately saw the glowing blue light emanating from the mask of a tall man standing on the left side of the road. This man must have stood 7 feet tall or more. The deer walked up to the man and stopped directly in front of him. My headlights fell directly on the pair. I had slowed down to about 15-20 miles an hour to avoid the collision, and I had a clear, direct view. The next second seemed like an hour in my mind. The man was tall, with a human build. He was wearing a black suit that had several tools and pockets. It reminded me of something a Navy SEAL would wear during the nighttime operation. He was covered from head to toe. The man wore gloves, boots, and a mask that all appeared to be connected. There was no skin exposed. It was kind of like an astronaut suit. He had a visor over his eyes that glowed a soft, velvety blue light. The visor was rectangular with rounded edges and was positioned to be consistent with human form. The light obscured the shape of the head somewhat, but again, I seemed to have a head consistent with a human form from a straightforward perspective. The tall man was watching me closely as I was watching him, and we passed slowly within a few feet from one another. We made eye contact, and the blue glow followed me in my rearview mirror until I made the next bend, and the man was out of sight. At this point, a very unsettling thing occurred. I felt this man call to me. It was more like a feeling, more than words. It wanted me to come back. It was a strong urge to turn around, mixed with feelings of peace and tranquility. Suddenly, I realized that I had unconsciously brought my car to a stop. This frightened me to the core. I immediately floored the car and drove through the stop sign at the end of the road as I raced home and to safety. My girlfriend and myself would experience additional encounters later, including the sighting of a huge black triangular-shaped craft overhead. Also, for several nights a week, I would suddenly wake up at precisely 3:33 a.m. for no apparent reason. I live in rural eastern Kentucky, one of those small towns surrounded by coal factories, mines, and farmland. I've lived in and around this town my whole life, so I know the area pretty well. At one point, I lived in a neighboring county with a population of about 1,000 people. Some family there, including a family cemetery, and the story takes place there. So, I'd had a rough couple days. I finally got a job last month, and now I have to wait for the blood screen results before I can go back because I have a sinus infection with barely any money saved up. To relieve the stress, I drive. I know the back roads, the main roads, the twists and turns. I can blast my music and just chill out when no one else is out and about. So I drove the half hour to the county over, turned around in the gas station parking lot, because, there's only one, and waited at the light, which is also the only one. The light takes a minute, and I know this, so I just chilled out. Cops get bored around here, so I didn't want to run it. I started to feel weird as soon as I stopped. Not like a being watched feeling, but like electricity, almost. That's the only way I can think to explain it. Just like the hair on my arms stood up and I couldn't figure out why. I started looking for signs of rain, but the sky was clear, and then I saw it. In my rearview mirror, I saw a deer, from what I could see, a doe, standing alone in the middle of the road. It was far enough back that I couldn't see features or anything, but close enough I could see its silhouette. Now, I've seen deer plenty of times. I thought it was weird the doe was alone, so I watched for a second. I assumed her roaming partners were in the trees, and the thing turns and starts walking toward my car. Again, weird because my car is a clunker and my music is loud enough that I could feel the bass with the windows rolled down, so it wasn't exactly quiet. The light is going to change in a minute, so whatever. I'm just feeling paranoid, right? But the feeling starts weighing down on me. The air feels super thick and I start to panic. I looked up at the deer again, and it's walking on its back legs. Like, not completely upright, but enough for me to notice. Like I caught it mid-stand. It's just walking toward my car. Its front hooves had to be like 4 or 5 inches from the ground. At this point, the light changes and I floor it out of there. Turned my high beams on and went about 30 over the limit for most of the way home. It all happened so fast and I can't stop thinking about it. I knew about not deer, but I've never seen one in person. I know nothing about them or how to ward them off, just that they look like deer, but they aren't. I honestly don't know if I want advice or just wanted somewhere to dump this, but I can't get this image out of my head. I've seen plenty of unexplained things around here, and I've dealt with this kind of thing my whole life. It was about 11 p.m. on a warm summer night, and I was driving home from a friend's house on a fairly rural back road. From a distance, I could see a cop car with its lights on pulled up in the middle of the lane, parked side by side next to a pickup truck. My first instinct was that maybe the truck had hit something or been pulled over, but it's weird because the cop wasn't pulled up behind the truck like they do. It was parked right next to it. I had my windows down because it was nice out, and I could hear the cop and the man shouting in conversation through their windows. I listened to the two talk from their windows and overheard the man in the truck say something like, "Man, something isn't right. It's not hit or injured. I just found it like that." This grown man had genuine fear in his voice and was just pointing frantically out his window, going on and on about how they should just shoot it. I turned my attention in the direction of where the guy and the cop are pointing, and my headlights illuminate the sight of a deer that is sitting directly beside the cop's car. It was extremely weird because the deer was sitting in perfect alignment with the yellow lines on the road, as if it had been intentionally trying to place itself on the line and in the direct middle of the two lanes. This thing looked like a prop or a statue the way it had assembled itself. I could see a liquid pooled around the deer that I assumed was blood, until I realized that the deer was seemingly uninjured and showed no visible signs of wounds or blood. While scanning the scene from my car behind the cop, I realized that the liquid that was pooled, and I mean pooled, around it wasn't blood, but was actually saliva that was falling from the animal's mouth like a waterfall, collecting all over the road and down its neck. Its head was weirdly shaped, skinnier than it should have been in contrast to its giant body, and it was bobbling like a bobblehead on a dashboard, staring straight in the direction of the cop and the truck. It looked hypnotized or something. I thought maybe it had rabies or something. Then I kind of tuned into my body and my stomach knotted up and my heart started racing. I can't describe the feeling here, but it sort of felt like I realized that time was moving super slowly, like in a dream or a daze. I was deciding if I should just wait there behind the cars or go around in the opposite lane when I noticed something else that was so off. This deer was sitting in a position that unnerved me to no end. This animal was literally sitting crisscross applesauce style, with its legs and joints all contorted and pretzeled into a way that seemed physically impossible, unless it had been manipulated by someone to do that. It was even more weird that it was sitting this way in the dead center of the road and directly aligned with the yellow line. It all looked so off and all felt like it was being experienced and processed by me in a disconnected and time-bending way. I immediately felt this unfamiliar, paralyzing fear inside my stomach and chest. I felt like I was seeing something that I shouldn't, or was someplace that I shouldn't be. I just wanted to get out of there, so I slowly veered into the opposite lane and creeped by the deer. My intuition was strongly telling me not to look out my passenger side window as I inched past the animal who was now eye level to my car and 2 feet away. I ended up looking, and when I did, it was like this thing knew before my eyes even hit it that I was looking at it. The deer shot its head around to face me and lock eyes with me, right as I looked at it. I will never, ever forget its eyes and the feeling they evoked in me. They were black, like darker than shadows black, and stared at me with some kind of intention or intelligence or something. I was physically paralyzed and drawn to a complete stop for what felt like minutes while this deer just stared at me with its cold eyes. I know this sounds crazy. Maybe it was just the fear. But those moments I was making eye contact with it, I felt like I was in a trance and like my whole life was sort of flashing before my eyes in a dreamy and terrifying way. I felt like 10 seconds became 10 minutes, and a weird vulnerability like a stranger walked in on me naked. Every hair on my body was standing up, and my heart was racing, and then it all just stopped, and I snapped out of it and drove on. I was terrified the whole way home, but also so curious for an explanation. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a sick deer or that it was hit and maybe internally injured. But so many details of how its legs were crossed and how it was placed and how it knew I was going to look at it before I did. And how its eyes looked, and it just made me feel, I don't know, it all just felt weirdly paranormal or unexplainable. I immediately hit the internet when I got home and discovered those diseases that make deer act off, and also for the first time heard about not a deer. That logical side of me wants to chalk that experience I had up to a diseased deer, but the part of me that felt and saw it just thinks there was something more to it. Needless to say, it was the hands down scariest experience of my life, and it really shook me for a while. I felt unsettled around deers ever since then. Even before the experience, I used to really enjoy seeing them, so I don't know how to explain what I saw and experienced that night, but I'll never forget it. A couple months ago, my friends and I were sitting in my car. The three of us had decided to pull over and chat because it was late on a weeknight and we had nothing to do but eat our Wendy's and enjoy each other's company. It's important to note that my car was not on, my lights were not on, my radio wasn't on, and nor were any of the windows open. Suddenly, a deer appeared, almost out of thin air. I had been looking in that direction the entire time, and the pond the deer appeared next to was very well lit. Strangely, my immediate thought upon seeing the deer was, "Skinwalker, get out." Of course, it might not have even been one, but even just seeing the deer, I panicked. I'd never been afraid of deer before, and before this moment, I associated them with my cherished moments spent with my grandpa during childhood. I turned to my friends and told them, "There's a deer. I think it's coming toward us." Before I'd even began to approach the car. The strange thing was, there was no reason for the deer to approach us at all. As I said earlier, we were not a disturbance, and the deer we spotted was alone. And more importantly, it was a male deer, with no females or babies within eyesight it would need to protect. The deer walked about 20 to 30 feet and stood about 10 feet from my vehicle. At this point, my friends were spooked too. I noticed the deer had one missing antler, and its eyes were different. It looked directly at me for about 30 seconds and got into a charging position. When we tried to drive away, it started charging at my car and even chased us until the parking lot ended and became the road. The strangest part was as we drove away, much further down the road, there were 3 male deer standing just behind the curb in a domino-like formation. The third one in the sequence was missing the same antler as the deer we encountered earlier. They did not run into the street or run off into the woods. They just stood there, staring us down. I wonder if something was keeping them in that park. Whatever it was, I hope it holds up. I'll preface this by saying I'm a skeptic. As much as I like supernatural things to exist, I find it hard to believe. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for what I encountered, but that doesn't stop it from being the weirdest thing that I've experienced. This was early 2006. I was a college student at VCU, and my friend was visiting me from out of town. We decided we would go ghost hunting because why not? Those type of shows were really popular at the time, and we were bored. I had gone a few months earlier with a group of friends to a place called Preacher's Rest in rural Tappahannock, Virginia. It turned out to be an old house in the woods where supposedly a church burned with people inside, I think. It's been a long time. Remembering this, I suggested it to my friend who agreed we should check it out. We picked up a friend and her boyfriend, and the four of us set out for Tappahannock, about an hour's drive away from Richmond. We ended up just driving around the empty wooded roads when we got there. I hadn't been driving the first time we went and couldn't remember exactly how to get there, other than a general store with a weird Elvis statue out front. My friend was in the passenger seat and the couple was in the back. We reached a road that was a straightaway for about a quarter of a mile, dipping down in the center before climbing back up. As we descended towards the dip, I saw a deer on the opposite side of the road. I slowed down since I've always been nervous about hitting one. The animal had its head bent near the ground, but right away I knew something was wrong. The legs were misshapen, knobby and twisted. I remember thinking maybe it was diseased or deformed as we approached it. Right when we were going to pass, the deer looked up and both my friend and I screamed. The deer had a man's face. We were going slow enough that I was able to take in every detail. The deer's neck became human skin, and the thing's eyes were wide in surprise, as if we weren't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend and shouted, "Did you see that?" My friend said, "Yeah, it had a dude's face." The couple in the back had been bickering, so they didn't see anything, and we tried to explain what we saw, but I'm not sure they really understood just how weird it was. We ended up hitting a dead end after a bit, so we had to turn around, meaning we had to go back to the road where we saw the deer man. This time we were all on full alert as we approached the dip in the road. Right where we saw the deer man, now on the passenger side, an adorable basset hound puppy was approaching the road from the trees. The couple wanted us to stop for the cute puppy, but there was no way I was going to slow down. I remember thinking that is a trap. I know there's a lot that could explain the deer. Disease, weird lighting, etc. But why the hell was that puppy in the exact spot as the deer man? I can't help but creating a story in my mind about what would have happened had we stopped. This story takes place in 2008 in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, if you're familiar with Charlottesville, the story takes place outside city limits in the county near Old Lynchburg Road, before all those student apartments were completed. At the time, I lived in Fry Springs on Sunset in a townhouse, and my roommate was using my vehicle, and I was at a friend in the county's house. So I decided to walk to the corner store to get some smokes. If you follow the trail in the backyard, it's a beautiful walk and a little quicker than driving around the windy roads. It wasn't dark yet, but the sun was going down and it was cooling off into a beautiful evening. So I asked my friend Jay if they want anything and head off to the trail that brings you out behind the country store. At first, my walk down the trail was just like any other. There were birds chirping, animal noises, a nice breeze. When I got to the split in the trail, for some reason, I began to feel really uneasy. My hair was standing on end. I felt like I was being watched. And I felt that heavy feeling in my stomach. but I'd walked this trail many of times and it wasn't that much further. That's when I started to hear crunching leaves and snapping twigs near me. I immediately scanned the area and was relieved when I spotted a large buck standing off the trail, partly behind the sycamore tree. First thing that struck me was the rack on this deer. The antlers were super thick and burly, more like moose antlers, but not quite. I just looked off. I decided to keep walking and noticed when I started walking, so did the deer. So I walked a little faster, and so did the deer. I stopped, and this deer took off in a full-blown sprint. Something about the way this thing moved was just so unnatural. It moved almost like a rocking horse, and its hind legs were in reverse of how they were supposed to be. It was very unsettling and prompted me to bust out in a full-blown run to the end of the trail. I am hauling butt down this trail being fueled by some form of primal fear. I come around the bend, and there in the middle of the trail is the not deer. I started trying to backpedal and fell straight on my behind. On the ground, I'm just looking up at this thing, and it hits me. This thing is a predator. It's got front-facing eyes. Deer don't have front-facing eyes. But that's not all that's wrong with it. Its face isn't right. It's too round, and it's got huge jowls, and its mouth is way too round to be a deer. The snout is far too short. So much is wrong. I scrambled to get to my feet, but whatever this thing was decided to stand on its hind legs when I stood up. I don't know if it thought I was challenging it, because it too stood up on its hind legs, but it was huge. It towered over me and had to be 8 feet tall. I turned around and started running as fast as I could, but I could hear the sounds of a bipedal stride close behind me. I never turned around. I was sure if I turned around, it would get me. When I reached the fork in the trail, I could no longer hear it behind me. When I got out of the woods, I started screaming like a maniac, so much so that my friend Jay came out the back door with a shotgun. I should mention my friend Jay is a backwoods mountain boy from Cripple Creek. He has a lot of native blood in his family. When I finally calmed down enough to explain what happened, Jay told me that wasn't a deer. He said in the woods there are a lot of things regular people don't know about, and what I encountered was one of those other things. He said it was up to something, and I disturbed it. Basically, when I was little, I was upstate with my grandparents and great-grandparents. We're outside of Wellsboro, and I need you to understand what this place is like. It's empty. The nearest cell signal is 10 minutes away. You have to drive 5 miles on a road to get to our place, cross a small creek, then drive up a considerable hill, and there's nothing up there. Absolutely nothing. Let me set the scene for you. About 20 yards away from each other on this piece of property, right in the center, is a camper and a shed. They're nice. They're the living quarters. My grandparents stayed in the shed. My great-grandparents stayed in the camper. We were in the camper most of the time we spent up there, unless we were sleeping. This was before I started sleeping in the camper, for fairly obvious reasons. I was trailing behind my grandmother. I had to run a frog or a salamander or something over to a teeny tiny creek near the side of the camper, because I found it on the step and didn't want it to get squished. I was alone outside for no more than 30 seconds. Behind the shed is a fairly steep drop-off, like a hill, and it's dense with forest. The barely there light from the camper will reflect off of any animal's eyes to tell you if they're there, tell you to be careful. I saw some, thought it was a deer, and thought it would run, but it didn't. It didn't act like a deer. In fact, it came closer. But it wasn't right. Its legs were too long, and they had too many joints. And it was proportioned like a moose, but it wasn't a moose. It was huge, and it wasn't running from me like deer are supposed to. It looked like someone stretched a deer over a small moose. It was horrible. And I didn't want to go closer, but I had to. I didn't have a choice. I didn't want to turn my back on it. So I did. It only seemed to use 3 of its legs, really. It had no antlers, so I assumed it was a doe. But it was too big, and its head was wide, and it wasn't right. It kept me awake in the cabin for almost 2 hours. I was convinced I'd see it again. Running past it was the worst feeling ever. It jerked, and it creeped, and it moved in a way that no real animal should. And it got under my skin. That happens when you sit around smelling the honeysuckle too long, I guess, but it got to me. Hair-raising. 'Cause I was so sure that it was a deer and that I was scaring myself, but that's not what deer look like. I slept in the camper every year after that. It's been 11 or so years, and I still can't get it out of my head. Because it wasn't a deer, it was some kind of beast, but it was not a damn deer. I lived in Waynesboro, Virginia for about 5 years. Less than 10 miles to the Blue Ridge Parkway north entrance, Skyline Drive south entrance. I used to take bike rides along Skyline Drive all the time, and always kept a year-long membership. Only in the day, though, just to frame the story. One night I was having a particularly hard time settling in for bed, so I decided to start up the bike and ride up to the first overlook on Skyline, only about a mile inside the park. It was about 11 p.m. when I got up there, and pitch black. I killed the bike and got immediately uncomfortable. I'm not a guy that gets spooked in the dark. Truthfully, I prefer the dark in most situations. You can see people before they see you. You're practically invisible unless someone is looking for you. And I find the natural privacy comforting. Not up there, though. It was a thick, oppressive dark. Worse than anything I experienced outside of a cave, and worse than any moonless night on the Appalachian Trail. I immediately got hinked out, big time. There's nothing up here besides wildlife, I reassured myself internally. I had my .44 mag revolver tucked into my concealed carry holster, so I knew I definitely outmatched anything that could be up there, 2-legged snakes included. So I sat in the dark, leaning against the bike for a while and looking at the few lights I could see in the valley below. I managed about 10 minutes before I physically felt the hair raise on the back of my neck. I only did 27 months in Iraq, but I remember that precise feeling. Someone was watching me. Something bad was coming. It was the same sensation I would get before enemy soldiers came in, or the shooting started somewhere nearby. I'm no psychic or whatever, but it's a common thing among vets with any time under their belt. Ask them about it. You can feel hateful eyes on you. The overlook was a sheer drop, or nearly so I wasn't concerned about anything popping up in that direction. But the mountainside and thick, untamed woods were behind me. I started thinking about methed out dudes creeping the Appalachian Trail, bears, and the like. The AT is no stranger to random violence. Still feeling creeped out, I took up a seat on the waist-high stone wall that marked the overlook ledge facing the woods. Again, I can't emphasize how dark it was. You might say, why not turn on the bike and use the lights? It'll at least help you see what's close. True, but my bike is loud, and the last thing I wanted was attention. Plus, the light would just night blind me to anything just out of view, and the noise would obscure any stealthy sounding creeping going on, so no thanks. I'll watch and listen for a bit. I sat in the dark for another 10 minutes or so, anxiety getting worse and worse. I heard a few things, but nothing out of the ordinary for a night in the woods. I decided to head on home since the feeling wasn't going away. Like I said, I had a big bore on me, so anything playing games would be in for a powerful surprise if the games got stupid. Hopping onto my Suzuki, I started it up and rode off towards the gate. Now, anyone who lives in the country and rides a bike knows that wildlife is crazy active on roads that aren't traveled often at night. Being nighttime, and technically closed because I had to go around a gate to get in, there were no other vehicles on the road at all. I hadn't seen a single other person since leaving Waynesboro proper. The speed limit was 30 miles an hour, but I clipped along at a measly 15 to keep an eye out for deer and wildlife. It wouldn't do me any good to tear myself up in a wreck, only to lay there all night until someone happened to cross me in the morning. Then I saw it. The term of almost deer is really fitting, but not quite accurate. It was like a deer that someone who had never seen a deer drew, but only after someone else described it to them. It stood on the left side of the road, the mountainside, and I saw the eyes long before my headlight shone it fully. It was big. Easily the biggest deer I've ever seen. And the lack of any horns that time in the year suggested that it was a doe. The head was almost bovine in shape, affixed to a deer's frame. The legs seemed too long in proportion to the body. Think maned wolf proportions. And the body was extremely barrel-chested. I've always been creeped out by malformed wildlife, and this was no exception. Unfortunately, I had to get it to move or risk passing within a few feet of it. I was not traveling another 30-plus miles up the road in the other direction to leave through another gate in the middle of the night, and I wasn't getting close to it. Dangers of it spooking and running into the side of my cruiser aside, I didn't want to get near it at all. Stopping and putting my feet down about 30 feet away from it, I tried to frighten it away. I flashed my beams down to low and back to high. Nothing. I revved my engine. Nothing. I honked the considerable horn, but nada. Resting the bike on the kickstand, I left it idling and hopped off. I yelled at the thing and it still didn't budge. So I started to the side of the road to grab something to toss near the deer thing, hoping to spook it that way. As soon as I crossed into the other lane, it rose up onto its hind legs. I froze, putting my hand on my gun. I wasn't about to get charged by an angry, confused, malformed doe. It took 2 jerky, unnatural steps toward the center of the lane on 2 legs and froze again, staring directly at me. It suddenly shook its head wildly like a dog with a toy, took another short step, and then hopped on 2 legs several times until it disappeared into the darkness on the right side of the road. I stepped back to the bike, mounted it, kicked up the kickstand, and turned the light towards the side of the road. On that side, there was a sheer drop-off about 70 to 80 degrees compared to the roadway. And the thing's head was just peeking over the edge, still looking at me. The drop-off was about 40 or 50 feet, so there's no way it was standing at the base of the mountainside. I cracked the throttle and beat it the hell out of there. road, wildlife be damned. I never went back up on Skyline Drive at night alone after that. One time was enough. There are things we don't know out there, or things that just visit for a while. Whatever it wasn't from around these here parts in Hill Talk. It can go back to wherever it came from and stay there. Okay, y'all. Those are today's not deer stories. Now let's talk about it. I read a lot more stories than the ones that I compiled here, and it seemed like not deer are characterized by having an intelligent look in the eyes. As you've heard, they very often raise up on their rear legs. Some of them can look rotted, like they're rotting. They're usually or often malformed. The eyes tend to be a big thing. An intelligent look in their eyes, knowing look, a sinister look. A look that isn't that, dumb, helpless, sweet deer look. And sometimes there was nothing appearing abnormal about the deer. Occasionally, I would find an encounter where someone just had that innate fear response, even when nothing seemed off that they could pinpoint. And that's really interesting. The best theory on not deer is chronic wasting disease. If you listened to the Alabama livestock mutilations episode, it is also a prion disease like Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which they were studying, and mad cow disease. So it is similar in that it affects the deer's brain and causes neurological deficits, a wasting appearance. It could cause some salivation. I do wonder if that salivating story could have been a deer with chronic wasting disease. It's a really, really sad thing. But it also doesn't explain how a deer's rear legs are on backwards. I don't know of anything that would explain that. But to me, the most fascinating part is seriously the innate, instinctive fear response that we have, especially when people have it before they even see what is scaring them. That feeling that we have when our hair raises on end and we know that something is very, very wrong and we're very afraid and we just don't even know what it is yet. That's very fascinating. It's our instincts telling us to run before we even know what we're running from. So in the stories where that happened, that's just fascinating to me how that happens. But anyhow, I do think chronic wasting disease is a very reasonable explanation for a lot of these stories, but not for others. Some of these I can't think of anything that would explain, and that's exciting. Because, while I am skeptical and reasonable about paranormal stuff, I also do enjoy believing in it. And it is interesting to think that there are some creatures out there, these not deer cryptids that we can't explain. Anyhow, as always, I want to know what you think. You can find me on social media at obscureappalachia. Check out the Instagram or Facebook page for some not deer photos for this episode. If you're enjoying these episodes, please subscribe, give me a rating on your podcast provider to help others find me. Thanks again, y'all. Until next time.